You wake up in a courtroom. But not just any courtroom. It's muddy. It smells like moldy hay, feet, and someone's nervous sweat, maybe yours, maybe the bailiff's. You're in 13th century France, so technically, you shouldn't be surprised. You're also barefoot. Northwest one told you court required shoes, but it's not like you'd be allowed to wear them anyway. Your opponent? A pig. A literal pig. Pink. Snorting. Covered in dried blood. Looking weirdly smug. She's on trial for murdering a child. You think you've had weird dreams before, but this one is particularly vivid and, unfortunately, real. You look around for a lawyer, but your choices are a monk with an attitude problem, a judge with a beard that looks like it's hiding secrets, and a scribe who keeps falling asleep. Oh, and the pig? Yeah, she has a lawyer. In fact, she has better representation than you ever had during your divorce. You lean back in your uncomfortable wooden bench, watching as the pig's defense lawyer begins his opening argument, passionately arguing that his client should not be executed because she was merely following her natural instincts. The crowd nods solemnly. Someone in the back mutters, "Poor girl." You're not sure if they mean the child or the pig. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure. It helps me out and also lets me keep making strange, sleepy, slightly depressing videos like this. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I always love seeing the Global Insomnia Club gather together for a soothing dose of historical absurdity. Now, back to the pig trial. This wasn't some isolated fever dream from a poorly documented French village with too much wine and not enough common sense. No, my friend. Animals on trial? That was an actual thing across Europe for hundreds of years. Not just pigs. Dogs, cows, rats, horses. At one point, the Catholic Church even sued an entire community of termites. In court. With witnesses. And legal paperwork. So let's get cozy and slowly tiptoe into one of the strangest corners of legal history, a time when humans dragged animals into courtrooms and sentenced them to death. Or exile. Or excommunication. All while wearing itchy wool robes and pretending this made sense. This will be long. It will be weird. It might make you sleepy. That's okay. That's the whole point. Let the candle flicker, lay back into your suspiciously lumpy pillow, and let's drift slowly into the past. First, let's talk about pigs, because pigs were, somehow, the most criminally charged animals in medieval Europe. They were the rock stars of beastly bad behavior. You might think of pigs as cute, oinking farm companions or bacon. But back then, pigs were basically free-range chaos machines. They wandered medieval towns like confused tourists, rummaging through garbage, pooping wherever they pleased, and occasionally, and this is not a joke, eating unattended children. Yes, children. The stories are grim, and so were the outcomes. Picture this, a 2-year-old wanders into the alley behind a butcher shop. A hungry sow, let's name her Gertrude, because she deserves some dignity before we execute her, is rooting around for scraps. The child trips, cries, flails. Gertrude thinks, oh, squeaky food, and, well, it doesn't end well. People scream. A crowd forms. And in a rare display of medieval justice, someone says, this pig must answer for her crimes. And she does. In court. With a judge. Witnesses. A defense attorney who probably once dreamed of becoming a knight, but now spends his life arguing for the innocence of poultry. The trial is public, of course. Everything was public. This was before reality television, so people had to entertain themselves somehow. You get a better crowd at a pig trial than at Sunday Mass. The pig is brought in wearing human clothes, often a little tunic. Sometimes trousers. No, this isn't an exaggeration. This was considered respectful to the court and also mildly hilarious, depending on how drunk the crowd was. The judge reads the charges out loud. Murder of a minor, aggravated squealing, unlawful consumption of a citizen. The pig just stands there. No remorse. Because, of course, she's a pig. The defense attorney steps up. Your Honor, my client had no malicious intent. She was hungry. This is a failure of supervision, not morality. The judge nods. Noted. But also, she did eat a toddler. And that's fair. Because she did. And then, execution. Usually by hanging. Yes. They hang pigs. in full ceremony, with a priest to bless the pig soul, a rope, a crowd of murmuring villagers, and the whole town standing around pretending this made sense. You're probably wondering, at this point, what drugs were in the medieval water supply? The answer is mostly contaminants, parasites, and lead, which explains a lot. But there was also something deeper at work here, something about how people saw animals, crime, and divine justice. See, medieval people didn't draw a clear line between humans and animals the way we do now. Today, we have this comfortable binary. Humans are humans, animals are animals, and unless your cat gets a lawyer, we don't usually expect them to appear in court. But back then, animals were part of the moral universe. They were capable of sin, of malice, of being influenced by the devil. That's a real quote. In fact, if a pig killed a child, some people believed it had been possessed. Not just naughty, literally possessed by Satan. And if the devil can possess pigs, then pigs are moral beings. And if they're moral beings, they can break the law. And if they break the law, they must be punished. In public, with dignity, and, preferably, with funny little trousers. But it wasn't just pigs. Let's talk about rats. Imagine this, it's 1457. You live in a small village in Burgundy. Your grain stores have been mysteriously disappearing. Not all at once, just slowly, steadily, chewed away night by night. You suspect rats. Everyone suspects rats. The town elders meet. A decision is made. You will sue the rats. A local ecclesiastical court is convened. A scribe files the paperwork. The rats are formally charged with theft and destruction of property. A priest is assigned to represent the rats in court. Yes, seriously. And his argument is magnificent. He opens by saying the rats didn't receive the court summons properly. After all, they're small. They're dispersed. They can't read. Also, coming to court would be dangerous because cats exist. The judge, remarkably, accepts this defense and adjourns the trial. The rats, he says, are entitled to safe conduct. Until then, no trial. Yes, the rats won on a procedural technicality. Eat your heart out, law and order. There's something charmingly bonkers about how seriously everyone took this. No one laughed. This wasn't satire. These were real people in itchy wool robes, standing in drafty stone rooms, solemnly arguing about the legal rights of rodents. Of course, not all animals got lawyers. Some just got blamed. Imagine being a goat in 16th century Switzerland. Someone gets sick. The village blames witchcraft. They find you, a goat with suspicious eyes, and declare that you've been cavorting with Satan. Boom. You're arrested, interrogated, possibly tortured, then burned at the stake. The charge? Conspiracy with witches. Also, you're a goat, so your defense options are limited. The line between human justice and religious hysteria was paper-thin back then. Everyone believed in divine order. If something bad happened, someone or something had to be responsible. And if that someone was a pig or a rat or a goat with judgmental eyebrows, then so be it. Justice must be served. And yes, that justice was wildly inconsistent. In one case, a pig was executed for murder. In another, a sow was spared because she had shown signs of repentance. How does a pig repent, you ask? Good question. The documents don't say. But I like to imagine it involved some apologetic oinking and very sad eyes. Sometimes, the animal got off entirely, usually if they were owned by someone important. Because, even back then, connections mattered. If your cow belonged to a bishop and it trampled someone to death, the cow would probably be declared divinely provoked and sent home with a pat on the back. If it was your cow, hanging. There's even a case where beetles were excommunicated. Not just any beetles. These beetles had infested a vineyard in St. Julian. The court issued a formal warning, leave or face divine wrath. The beetles did not leave. They were beetles. So they were excommunicated. Now, it's fair to ask, did this ever work? Did it make the beetles go away? No, not even once. But it made people feel better. Like they had some control over an uncontrollable world. Grain rots. Children die. Rats eat your wheat. But if you can sue the rat, maybe the universe isn't totally random. Maybe someone is listening. Even if that someone is an imaginary rat lawyer in a tiny hat. At its core, these animal trials weren't about logic. They were about ritual, about making sense of things, about blaming something, anything, for the messiness of medieval life. And they reveal a world where the lines between religion, justice, and superstition weren't blurry. They were non-existent. You start to feel the weight of the wool blanket on your legs. It's itchy, yes, but comfortingly so. Your eyelids grow heavier as you imagine the gentle hum of a courtroom filled with candles, snoring scribes, and one very bewildered pig in a waistcoat. The trial drones on. Witnesses are called. None of them speak Pig Latin. The prosecutor is sweating. The defense lawyer is gently weeping into his parchment. And you, lucky you, get to drift deeper into sleep, knowing that somewhere, long ago, a beetle stood accused in the eyes of God. Sleep well. The pig forgives you. You wake up in a small wooden cell. Not yours, this one's built for two. One human, one cow. The cow, to be clear, looks annoyed. She has been falsely accused of arson, and frankly, she's over it. You glance down and notice your shoes are gone. Again, you're in 14th century Saxony, and apparently, no one owns shoelaces yet. Your mattress is straw. Not the nice kind. The kind that pokes you in the spleen and smells vaguely like betrayal and turnips. A guard walks by and spits near your cell door, muttering something about the demonic cow. The cow looks up slowly, chews, and sighs. She's innocent. Obviously. But in this world, in this particular flavor of poorly ventilated medieval justice, that doesn't mean anything. Welcome back to the courtroom of your dreams, where the accused may have 4 legs, feathers, or an impressive tail-to-body ratio, and where logic comes to die wearing a robe and powdered wig. Today, we're going to talk about how these animal trials actually worked, from start to finish. You see, if you're going to sentence a goose to death for being overtly suspicious, there's a process. A protocol. A kind of chaotic dignity that comes with pretending your judicial system isn't being regularly outwitted by livestock. So let's begin. It starts with a crime. Maybe a child has gone missing. Maybe a villager discovers that his fields have been desecrated by a particularly judgmental flock of pigeons. Or maybe, and this happened more than once, someone wakes up to find that their donkey has trampled their neighbor to death. Now, you might think, well, accidents happen. But no. This is the Middle Ages. There is no such thing as coincidence. There is only punishable intention. So the villagers do what all self-respecting medieval communities do. They form a crowd, start pointing fingers, and immediately seek out a priest. Because if a goat can sin, only the church can forgive. Now here's where it gets fun. There were actually 2 kinds of animal trials. You had the secular ones. Those were for animals that committed crimes against humans. These would happen in civil or criminal courts. Then you had the ecclesiastical ones, church-run affairs, usually for things like plagues of insects, morally compromised livestock, or the ever-popular demonic possession via poultry. Secular courts were usually reserved for individual animals who committed violent acts. Think, pigs who ate babies, bulls who gored farmers, and horses who trampled unsuspecting barmaids during their daily rage laps. Ecclesiastical courts? More dramatic. Less personal. These were for when an entire species decided to act out, like mice eating all your barley or locusts performing aerial acrobatics over your vineyard. The church would then sue the entire group. Yes, all of them. Collectively, even the innocent ones. The first step in the trial process was the summons. And I do not mean metaphorically. This was an actual written summons, usually nailed to a church door or tree, addressed to the offending animal or animals. It might read, "To the rats currently destroying the town's wheat reserves, you are hereby commanded to appear in court 3 days hence to answer for your crimes." And guess what? If the animals didn't show up, the court didn't throw out the case. Oh no. The trial would continue in absentia. Because clearly, rats read slowly and need extra time. Now, for individual trials, say, a pig who bit off someone's face, the pig would be physically brought to court. Often in chains. Sometimes in a little cart, and again dressed in people clothes. Because what's the point of holding a trial for a pig if she's not wearing trousers? The animal would then be formally charged. Often, the charges were worded just like human ones: murder, theft, public indecency. One cow in 1474 was accused of acts of sexual perversion because she stood too long near the church altar. Yes, apparently that was a thing. And then came the legal representation. Because, of course, the animal was entitled to a lawyer. These were often local clerics or minor officials, people with just enough education to be dangerous and clearly not enough to say no when asked to represent a goat accused of blasphemy. These lawyers took their jobs very seriously. There are actual surviving transcripts where the lawyer for a group of beetles argues that they have as much right to exist as any other creature made by God, and that they may even serve a divine purpose unknown to man. The judge, in that case, ruled that the beetles be exiled rather than excommunicated. Diplomatic victory. The trial would proceed like any other. There'd be witnesses, usually the traumatized victims or their equally traumatized neighbors. There'd be arguments, rebuttals, and occasionally, expert testimony, usually from priests who claimed to know whether or not the animal had been under satanic influence. The animal, meanwhile, would just stand there, pooping quietly, perhaps blinking once or twice in vague curiosity. If convicted, and most were, the animal would be sentenced. The most common punishment was execution. Methods varied. Pigs were usually hanged. Horses and bulls might be decapitated. Dogs were often drowned, particularly if they'd been accused of drinking too much blood. In one case, a rooster was burned alive for laying an egg, which was considered sorcery. Because of course it was. But sometimes, animals got lighter sentences. Exile was popular. Yes, banishing a pig from a village was somehow seen as more sensible than, say, building a fence. One donkey, found guilty of kicking a priest, was spared death on the condition that she be relocated to a less spiritually vulnerable area. Another was given lashes, 20, to be exact, administered by a court official, who we assume had drawn the short straw that morning. Insects, being hard to catch and harder to flog, were usually excommunicated. This involved long ceremonies, chants, sometimes holy water, and the hope that the bugs would feel bad and leave. They didn't. But the wine was good, and everyone got a day off work, so win-win. Let's not forget the public executions. These weren't small affairs. Entire towns would show up. The animal was paraded through the streets, sometimes with a sign describing the crime. Children were encouraged to attend, because nothing teaches good morals like watching a goat get hanged for witchcraft. People would bring food. There might be musicians. It was a party. A weird, smelly, deeply disturbing party where you and your neighbors bonded over the slow, squealing death of a barnyard criminal. The psychology behind this is fascinating. It's easy to mock it now, and we absolutely will, but back then, this was about order. Justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about purification. Restoring balance, making the world make sense. If a pig kills a baby and nothing happens, what does that say about the universe? But if the pig is punished, ceremonially, ritually, then things feel a little more fair, a little less chaotic, a little more under control, even if the whole thing is profoundly unhinged. And let's be honest, people were terrified of chaos. The world was brutal. Disease, famine, war, random acts of weather. You could die from soup. You could die from a sneeze. The idea that anything, even a chicken, could be held accountable, that was comforting. It was also political. Animal trials reinforced the idea that the law is absolute, that no one, not even a ferret with a bad attitude, was above it. In some cases, punishing the animal also meant punishing the owner. If your ox gored someone, you might not go to jail, but you'd lose your animal, your livelihood, your dignity. It was a form of social control wrapped in a veil of divine justice. And then, finally, came the records. Oh yes, they wrote it all down. Hundreds of pages. Legal arguments. Witness statements. The occasional courtroom sketch, although most animals were just represented as vaguely aggressive blobs with legs. These records survive. They're in dusty archives, read by tired scholars and, occasionally, insomniacs like you. So now, as you lie there, nestled in your sheets or maybe just buried under the emotional weight of modern life, picture this, a squirrel on trial. He's accused of stealing holy relics. The courtroom is full. A monk is arguing passionately about the sanctity of relics. The squirrel blinks once, unbothered. He is sentenced to exile. He leaves, probably to go do more crimes. But justice, for now, has been served. Your breathing slows. The air is cool. The candle burns lower. Somewhere in your dreams, a beetle receives a summons. A pig is fitted for trousers. A chicken lays an egg and is immediately arrested. History is nonsense. But it's our nonsense. And somehow, that makes it all feel weirdly peaceful. Sleep well. The cow forgives you. You wake up again. Same scratchy blanket. Same inexplicable hay in your shirt. But this time, you're not alone. You're seated in what appears to be a courtroom. Not the kind you see on TV, with polished wood and dramatic lighting. No, this is more damp. More barn that went to college. There's a judge. He's wearing a wig made of what looks like horsehair and the smug expression of someone who's about to pass sentence on a duck. In the front row, a goat stares intently at the proceedings, perhaps awaiting his own fate. His expression says, "I know what I did." But do the humans? A rooster flaps wildly as a clerk reads out the charges: crimes against the Sabbath, multiple noise violations, suspicion of heresy. The rooster crows, proudly. Bold move. You sigh. You've seen enough to know how this ends. But tonight, we're not just watching the drama unfold. We're digging deeper. Because as bizarre as these animal trials were, they weren't just some chaotic sideshow from the past. No, they had rules, procedures, entire legal frameworks built around the concept of sending a hedgehog to the gallows. So before you drift too far into sleep, let's unravel the strange legal backbone of this medieval animal justice system. You know, foreclosure. First, let's talk about jurisdiction. That's right, even in the Middle Ages, there were rules about who could try what. You couldn't just drag a chicken into any courtroom and demand vengeance. The question was, who has the right to judge the rooster? Is it the local lord, the bishop, the town council, or, heaven help us, the pope? And the answer depended entirely on the nature of the crime. If the animal committed a violent act, say, a pig mauling a child, this would usually fall under secular law, meaning the local authorities would take over. Picture a bored magistrate, halfway through a flagon of something brown and unpleasant, having to hear testimony about how the pig looked him directly in the eye before the attack. The magistrate nods sagely, strokes his lice-infested beard, and declares, "Bring forth the defendant." On the other hand, if a swarm of beetles destroyed a vineyard or rats ruined communion bread, that was considered a spiritual crime, an offense against the divine order. In those cases, it was up to the church courts. Yes, the same courts that tried witches, heretics, and occasionally theologians with too many opinions. These courts could summon the entire rat population and order them to vacate the premises within 8 days or face damnation. And yes, they wrote that down. In Latin. Now, when it came to evidence, things were a little flexible. There was no DNA, no CCTV footage, just eyewitnesses and vibes. And when you're trying to determine whether a rooster is intentionally crowing during Mass, vibes go a long way. Witness testimony could include such statements as, "The dog was seen lingering near the crime scene. The pig was found with blood on her snout. The donkey was heard braying disrespectfully during the Lord's Prayer." Strong stuff. Sometimes, you'd even get a kind of medieval expert witness. A priest. A monk. Maybe even a village-wise woman, although her presence alone might accidentally spark a witch trial, so best to keep that risk low. The expert would determine whether the animal had acted under its own will or had been possessed by Satan. Yes, again with Satan. He was busy. Apparently, between inciting war, famine, and papal intrigue, he had time to briefly inhabit a goat so that it could urinate on a holy relic. You might be wondering, was there ever a case where they thought the animal was innocent? Surprisingly, yes. In some cases, if the animal was young or had no previous record of wrongdoing, I wish I was joking, it could be spared. The argument was that the animal had not yet achieved the mental maturity to understand right from wrong. A sort of porcine parole, if you will. In one case, a sow was executed for murdering a child. But her piglets, also present at the scene, were acquitted. The court decided they were too young to understand the act. The piglets were returned to the farm, where they lived out their lives in disgrace but freedom. Probably got a memoir deal. And then there's the concept of intention. This is where things get weirdly philosophical. In medieval law, intention mattered. You couldn't just convict an animal because it happened to be present. There needed to be a willful act. a motive, an attitude. Yes, animals were judged on attitude. If a dog bit a man while being abused, the dog might be spared. But if the dog bit a nobleman without provocation, and witnesses testified that the dog looked menacing, then it was over. That dog was toast. This led to strange lines of questioning. Like, did the goose appear hostile? Did the ox give the impression of malice? Was the cat's meow interpreted as blasphemous? The answer was almost always yes. Because once the accusation was made, people tended to lean into the drama. After all, if the cat was possessed, then your missing bread wasn't your fault. Win-win. Now let's take a step back, literally, because we need to appreciate the theater of it all. Animal trials were public spectacles. Not just legal proceedings, but pageants. They involved full processions, where the condemned animal would be paraded through the streets. People would gather. Children would giggle. Vendors would sell snacks. Somewhere, a lute player played something vaguely upbeat. Justice was a show, and animals made for memorable actors. In some towns, the animal was given a last meal. A priest would visit the condemned. Not for confession, obviously, but for blessing the soul. Because even if the pig was a murderer, she was still one of God's creatures. Then came the execution itself. Hangings were common. Sometimes the animal was strung up in a town square, the same way you'd hang a thief. The spectacle was important. It had to be seen, to be believed. This wasn't about reform. It was about warning others, both humans and, inexplicably, animals. Other times, particularly with birds, the method was burning. Why? Because fire was purifying. Also, it was dramatic. Plus, it helped prevent the spread of disease, since medieval folks often suspected animals were disease vectors. They were, but not, like, on purpose. There were even mass trials, where hundreds of insects were condemned in a single verdict. Locusts, weevils, caterpillars, all judged as a species. Sometimes the court would give them safe passage to leave the area. We grant you 7 days to depart. After that, we shall have no choice but to anathematize you. The insects, predictably, ignored this. Now, if you're thinking this sounds incredibly wasteful and strange, well, yes. But it also served a deep social purpose. Animal trials reinforced the idea that everything, even chaos, could be categorized, addressed, and punished. It created a sense of moral structure. When a tragedy struck, a child's death, a ruined harvest, there had to be someone to blame. And when you couldn't blame a person, you blamed the goat. Also, let's be honest, it was a power move. When the church excommunicated rats or frogs, it wasn't because they expected results. It was about demonstrating authority. Look how powerful we are. We can issue a decree against insects. It sent a message to the peasants, to the nobility, to rival churches. We control the narrative. Meanwhile, the actual animals were blissfully unaware. The rat didn't know it was being sued. The rooster didn't understand why the bishop looked so tense. The pig, even as she stewed on the gallows, probably just wondered when lunch was arriving. And still, the system persisted. Animal trials occurred regularly across France, Germany, Italy, Switzerland, and parts of England. Some towns even had repeat offenders, like one village where the same goat family was tried 3 generations in a row. At some point, you have to admit the goat dynasty might just be cursed. Eventually, the trend faded. The Enlightenment happened. People discovered science, microscopes, and basic common sense. But the records remain. Thousands of pages documenting a world where the line between human and animal was blurry, and where justice wore a wig and pointed at pigs. Southwest, as you close your eyes tonight, let that thought comfort you. Somewhere, in a crumbling archive, lies a parchment declaring that a hedgehog was found guilty of tax evasion. And someone, probably named Brother Hubert, took that verdict very seriously. Justice, after all, is eternal, even if it occasionally involves ducks. Sleep tight. You wake up in a monastery cell. Again, you really need to stop booking the hay bale suite. It's about the consistency of gravel, with the warmth of a tax audit. You stretch your arms, trying not to hit the rat that's sharing your pillow. He's seen things. You can tell by the look in his eyes. Probably stood trial once. Maybe twice. Maybe he's your lawyer. Either way, you nod respectfully. He nods back. This morning, Or what passes for morning in a world with no clocks and exactly two kinds of weather, mud or plague? You've got a new task, research. You've been asked to investigate how entire species ended up in court. Not individual animals. Not pig with anger management issues or chickens who refuse to shut up during Massachusetts' whole populations. Communities of bugs, frogs, birds. The animal version of a class action lawsuit. Yes. You're about to attend a mass excommunication. But first, sit up, get comfortable. And if your hay bed doesn't cooperate, adjust it slightly until it feels less like betrayal and more like mild disappointment. And while you're still semi-conscious, why not take a moment to like this video and subscribe? If you're enjoying this gentle descent into historical absurdity, leave a comment with your location and what time you're listening. I love seeing who's joining me from across the globe, whether you're lying in bed, stuck on a train, or wide awake next to a snoring pug. Now then, back to the weevils. It's the 16th century, and you're in a sleepy alpine village somewhere in what is now Switzerland. The people here are dealing with an infestation, not of bandits or heretics this time, but something far worse, insects. Specifically, weevils. Tiny, smug little beetles with an inexplicable hunger for barley crops. The villagers, understandably, are at their wits' end. So, they do what any reasonable, spiritually panicked population would do. They contact the local bishop and ask if the church would kindly sue the weevils. Not exterminate them. Not poison them. Not trap them. No, litigate them. And this isn't just metaphor. This is real, official, Latin-drenched courtroom drama. The church agrees. A formal summons is issued, written in proper legalese, addressed to the offending weevils, demanding they appear in court on a specified date, at a specified time. The idea is that these creatures, though small, are still part of God's creation, and thus subject to His law. Their crime? Destroying crops meant for human survival. The punishment? Excommunication. Banishment. Divine eviction. There are scribes involved. Monks. Probably someone took minutes. Somewhere in a dusty monastery archive, there's a parchment that reads, "The weevils failed to appear." Classic weevil behavior. And this is not an isolated case. These group trials happened all over Europe. Let's do a little gentle time traveling. In Lausanne, in 1451, there was a full ecclesiastical trial held against slugs. Yes, slugs. The accusation? Having committed great and incalculable damage to the vineyards. The court, and I wish I were making this up, assigned them legal counsel. A human lawyer, trained in canon law, tasked with representing the slug's best interests. How does one argue on behalf of slugs? Your Honor, my clients had no malicious intent. They were simply following their instinctual need to slime things. Or maybe, due to their lack of skeletal structure, my clients were physically unable to comprehend church doctrine. Ironclad. Sometimes, the court would even issue warnings to the creatures. Like, "Hey beetles, you've got 14 days to pack your tiny beetle bags and leave this sacred barley field. Otherwise, we'll unleash the spiritual equivalent of a restraining order." When the beetles failed to comply, because, well, they're beetles, the court would proceed with a formal curse. This was often a long, impressive document, full of divine threats. The kind of text you'd expect a wizard to shout before summoning a thunderstorm. And it would be read aloud by a priest, sometimes even with incense and candles, as if casting the insects out through sheer ritualistic disappointment. It rarely worked, but it felt good to do something, even if that something was yelling at bugs in Latin. One famous case occurred in Auden, France, in the year 1480. A plague of caterpillars was eating its way through the vegetable gardens. The townspeople petitioned the bishop to get involved. A lawyer was appointed to represent the caterpillars. He argued, and this is spectacular, that the caterpillars were part of the natural order created by God, and therefore had a divine right to eat their share of the earth. This prompted the church to counter-argue that the caterpillars should remain within designated boundaries and not feast upon land specifically consecrated for human food. It was a theological zoning dispute between humans and bugs. The court eventually ruled that the caterpillars must leave. A date was set for their departure. Spoiler, they did not go. The church responded by anathematizing them, essentially calling down divine judgment. Some believed this could kill the insects. More often, It just made everyone feel slightly holier while their vegetables died anyway. You might think this is laughable, and it is, but there's something strangely elegant about it. These trials were never about actual enforcement. They were about cosmic order, ritual, control in the face of chaos. When you live in a world where your fate depends on weather, luck, and whether the local baron wakes up in a bad mood, having a structured way to yell at nature feels like justice. Insects weren't the only targets. Mice were frequent offenders, especially in monasteries. They chewed through parchment, bread stores, even sacred vestments. In one case from Brescia, Italy, a formal curse was placed on the community of mice infesting a cathedral. A priest stood at the altar and invoked angels, saints, and possibly the ghost of St. Francis, all to chase out rodents. And then there's the 1519 case in Stelvio, South Tyrol, where local farmers sued a group of field mice. The mice were formally accused. Their representative, again a human lawyer, pleaded for mercy, noting that the mice had children to feed. The court, in a moment of transcendent ridiculousness, agreed to set aside a small field where the mice could continue living peacefully. This is real. The court established a mouse sanctuary, an early version of you do you, but not in our cabbage. Even larger animals got group treatment. In parts of rural France, packs of wolves were excommunicated en masse. Not hunted, not trapped, just cursed. Entire sermons were delivered wherein priests would denounce the wolves for attacking flocks and endangering souls. The wolves, as expected, were unmoved. Then there were frogs. Frogs were a nuisance not for their eating habits, but for their noise. In certain convents and monasteries, the frog chorus near the water supply was deemed disruptive to evening prayer. In at least 2 documented cases, frogs were ordered to be silent, on pain of divine punishment. Astonishingly, the frogs obeyed. Or, more likely, the monks chose a night when the frogs were naturally quiet and called it a miracle. Either way, there was celebrating. God had silenced the frogs. Until the next humid evening, anyway. But of all the bizarre cases, the most memorable might be the 1545 trial of the leeches of Lausanne. The town's water supply had become infested with leeches, and local swimmers were emerging less enthusiastically than they entered. The leeches were summoned to court. When they failed to appear, again, leeches, the bishop performed a public exorcism of the lake itself. The results? Mixed. The lake remained leechy, but the bishop got to wear his fanciest hat. So, small victories. All of this might sound like the hysterical reaction of a deeply confused society, and to be fair, it was, but it also reveals something more poignant. These trials were about order. When faced with plagues, storms, crop failure, and random outbreaks of foot rot, people craved something they could control, something they could yell at. If not the king, then the goat. If not the priest, then the rat. Animal trials weren't just about punishing animals. They were about telling a chaotic, terrifying world that someone was still in charge, even if it was a guy in robes cursing worms. So next time you're lying awake, frustrated that the mosquitoes in your room seem to have unionized against you, just remember, at least you don't have to represent them in court tomorrow. Now close your eyes. Listen to the soft, imaginary sound of frogs ignoring a legal summons. Let your mind drift into the slow, gentle current of centuries-old absurdity. Sleep comes easily when the weirdest part of your day is over. And trust me, we haven't even gotten to the donkeys yet. You wake up in a medieval courtroom. Not as a spectator. Not even as a scribe. No, you are, unfortunately, the defendant. Again. You glance down. You have hooves. You are a donkey. Yes, welcome to one of the most tragically comedic chapters in legal history, the saga of equine injustice. Because in the centuries between plague outbreaks and failed crusades, humanity apparently had enough spare time to drag donkeys, mules, and the occasional ox into court. And not as witnesses, as accused criminals, felons, miscreants of the barnyard. You're shackled. Not metaphorically. You're literally bound by ropes that smell like mildew and regret. Your cell is a wooden stall attached to the back of the courtroom. There's straw, but it's more decorative than functional. Your water is green. Your cellmate is a depressed chicken who says she's innocent. You don't believe her. You look out the tiny window, and the bells are tolling. It's trial day. And this isn't just you. This chapter, this entire surreal barnyard opera, is about animals who were convicted, punished, and yes, sometimes executed, for crimes ranging from theft to assault, to the ever-popular being inconvenient in public. But before we guide your sleepy hooves through the worst day of your medieval donkey life, let's do the modern housekeeping. If you're still listening and your eyes haven't fully betrayed you into REM sleep, go ahead and like the video. Subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I'm always amazed how many of you are drifting off to sleep in one time zone while someone else is listening to this nonsense on their lunch break in another. All right. Now, back to being on trial for your life as a donkey. Let's start with a case so infamous it was actually recorded in multiple versions across France and Switzerland. It's the year 1386, and the town of Falaise in Normandy is holding what they consider a perfectly reasonable legal proceeding. A mother pig has been accused of murder. According to the court documents, which absolutely do exist, the pig allegedly attacked a human infant, causing fatal injuries. The pig was arrested, tried in a secular court, and, get this, sentenced to death by hanging. But that's not the weirdest part. The pig was dressed in human clothes for the execution. A tunic and gloves were provided. Perhaps a small bonnet. We don't know. It was 1386. Fashion was fluid. Justice was not. Hundreds of townspeople showed up for the spectacle. Some brought snacks. Others probably complained about the lack of bleacher seating. It was a civic event. Like a modern county fair, if your main attraction was capital punishment for livestock. Now, the execution of pigs was surprisingly common. But other animals didn't escape the noose either. In the town of Savigny, in 1499, a bull was tried and executed for, wait for it, killing a man in a field. The bull didn't even get to plead insanity. He was just hanged. Publicly. Let's talk about that for a moment. Have you ever tried to hang a bull? Hopefully not. But imagine the logistics. Ropes. Pulleys. At least 5 people shouting Latin at each other. All to send a message to other bulls, apparently, that murder will not be tolerated. Which brings us to you, the donkey. Because yes, donkeys were sometimes put on trial for behavior considered indecent. There's a famous case from the early 1700s in the French village of Ambres, where a donkey was reportedly the victim of abuse by a man named Jacques Ferrin. Shockingly, the donkey was not the one put to death. The villagers gathered testimony from several people who testified to the donkey's good character. Yes, you heard that right. Multiple people vouched for her virtue. One priest said she had always behaved modestly and properly. She was essentially acquitted based on her reputation. Meanwhile, Jacques was executed. The donkey lived. So you can take comfort in that, dear sleepy donkey. Your day in court may be humiliating, but if your neighbors think highly of you, you might get off with just a public apology and a new job pulling carts. Still, the very fact that a donkey's moral behavior was legally debated says a lot about the times. Animals weren't always seen as mindless beasts. In fact, in the twisted tapestry of medieval legal systems, animals were often thought to possess a sort of moral agency. They were expected to obey natural law. And if they didn't, they could be punished, even ceremonially excommunicated, as if their little hoof souls needed saving. It wasn't just about pigs and donkeys. In 1750, in Marseille, a mule was put on trial for, well, it's unclear exactly what the mule did. But the court record indicates that both the mule and its owner were sentenced to hang. No transcript survives, but we can assume the defense was something like, Your Honor, the mule acted on its own. A bold move, since mules don't usually fill out tax forms. There's also the fascinating case of roosters, who often found themselves in hot water for allegedly laying eggs. Yes, male chickens. Laying eggs. Which is biologically impossible unless it's actually a hen with identity issues. But back then, if a rooster laid an egg, it was believed to be the work of the devil. Specifically, the belief was that a rooster's egg, if incubated by a toad, naturally, could hatch into a basilisk. So the rooster would be put on trial, found guilty of unnatural behavior, and executed. Because clearly the only thing more dangerous than ignorance was imaginative ignorance. Let's pause here just for a moment and breathe. Deeply. Slowly. Inhale. Picture the smell of a 14th century French courtroom, a mix of candle wax, wool cloaks, and unbrushed humanity. Exhale. Let the absurdity settle like dust in a law book. You're starting to feel it now, aren't you? That gentle tug of historical fatigue. That soft hum of "I cannot believe this actually happened." That's the magic of sleep creeping in. But before you drift off entirely, let's do one more. In Bourg-en-Bresse, in the 15th century, a cow was put on trial for goring a mun to death. The court concluded that the cow had acted with intent. It was found guilty. The sentence, hanging, again. As if the cow had filled out a conspiracy plan and mailed it to the local tavern. The execution was carried out in full view of the townspeople. Because nothing says civic unity like watching a confused cow dangle from a poorly engineered gallows. It's worth noting that some of these executions were not just punishments, they were warnings. Public displays. A message to the village, order will be preserved. Even if we have to tie a pig to a post and declare it an enemy of the state. But as bizarre as all this is, it's also weirdly human. There's something darkly poetic in our need to assign blame, even when the universe shrugs. When crops fail, we curse the weevils. When someone dies tragically, we blame the cow. When life feels unpredictable, we drag a goat into court and ask it to explain itself. Because justice, even when deeply confused, brings structure to chaos. And in the medieval world, chaos was always just one bad winter away. So now, as you curl up under your blanket, a modern invention with no lice, remember, you are not on trial. You are not a pig in a tunic. You are a person in a peaceful bed, drifting slowly into dreams filled with sleepy donkeys and sarcastic bishops. Let the absurdity settle around you like hay in a forgotten barn. And rest easy, knowing that at least you weren't born in a century where your biggest legal risk was being mistaken for a rooster with a demon egg. Good night, fellow ex-defendant. We'll resume court in the morning. You wake up to the sound of distant chanting. Gregorian, probably. It's early. Too early. You were dreaming about normal things, clouds, toast, maybe a coffee that didn't taste like burnt barley. But now you're awake, and something's wrong. You're cold. You're also wearing a small iron bell around your neck. That's right. You're a goat mow. And you've been summoned to court. Again. Because apparently being a goat in medieval Europe was a high-risk profession, especially if someone decided your existence made them uncomfortable, or your eyes looked untrustworthy, or your beard resembled a local wizard's. And this chapter, this next 3,000 words of historical indigestion, is about the truly unhinged role of supernatural suspicion in animal trials. Because it's one thing to accuse a pig of murder, but it's another entirely to burn a cat alive because you think it made the weather bad. Yes. We're going there. Let's start with the goats. Goats, you may have noticed, have eyes that resemble tiny occult portals. At least that's how medieval Europe felt. Those eerie rectangular pupils weren't just seen as weird, they were obviously signs of satanic influence. After all, what normal, God-fearing animal can climb vertical cliffs, scream like a human, and knock over an entire barrel of turnips without flinching? In a society where mild thunderstorms could be interpreted as the wrath of God, goats were basically walking lawsuits waiting to happen. In 1457, in the French region of Jura, a goat was arrested and tried for devilish behavior. What that means is never clearly stated. But given the era, it probably involved knocking over a candle or sneezing at the wrong time during Mass. The goat was interrogated, no, really, and eventually excommunicated by the local bishop. This is a real thing that happened. They read an official statement, banned the goat from communion. The goat reportedly responded with silence, which was seen as either guilt or pride. No one knows what happened to the goat afterward. It probably ended up in a stew. But the larger point is, superstition and law were often horrifying roommates. This brings us to cats. If goats were suspicious, cats were practically Satan's interns. Especially black cats, who were accused of everything from summoning demons to influencing fertility rates to, my personal favorite, causing bread to rise improperly. Yes, bread. You wake up one day in 1312, your sourdough is flat, and boom, blame the cat. During the height of the witchcraft panic, cats were frequently tortured, drowned, or burned alongside their suspected human counterparts. In some places, laws were passed stating that if a woman was convicted of being a witch, her cat could also be tried, sentenced, and executed, just to be safe. And if you're imagining a medieval judge staring at a yowling tabby and saying, "Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Yes, that basically happened. More than once. There's a recorded incident from 1324 in Kilkenny, Ireland, where Dame Alice Kytler, a wealthy noblewoman, was accused of witchcraft. Among the many damning pieces of evidence against her, her pet cat, who allegedly spoke to her in Latin. To be fair, if your cat starts quoting Cicero, you probably do have a problem. But instead of checking for ventriloquism or shared delusion, the church's response was to arrest the cat. Its fate is not recorded, but given the circumstances, it was likely not ideal. Let's talk about weather crimes. Yes, in this part of history, the weather could be considered a crime scene, and someone or some animal had to be blamed. Frogs, mice, birds, even oxen were sometimes accused of attracting storms by standing in sinful locations. There's a charming case from Switzerland around 1470, where a group of crows was blamed for bringing a hailstorm that destroyed several crops. The town council attempted to summon the crows to court via public notice, and when the birds did not appear, shocking, they were tried in absentia and banished from the region. Yes, birds, banished. And because no one could explain the hail, and because local weather apps were 500 years away, the verdict stood. This wasn't a one-off, either. In a 1519 case in Autun, France, moles were taken to court for destroying crops. They were offered legal representation. A lawyer actually stood up in court and argued on behalf of the moles. He tried to delay sentencing by claiming the moles needed more time to gather evidence. Ultimately, the court excommunicated the moles and gave them 14 days to vacate the area or face divine consequences. It's unclear if the moles complied. Let's slow down and breathe again. Inhale. Picture yourself standing in the center of a ruined village square, surrounded by rain, holding a small hedgehog. Everyone is staring at you like you've brought disaster upon them. Exhale. You drop the hedgehog. It waddles away. Justice is satisfied. In medieval Europe, there was no clear line between science, law, and religion. Everything was spiritual. Everything was symbolic. Your crops didn't fail because of soil depletion. They failed because someone let their chicken wander on a Sunday. And speaking of chickens, we need to talk about heretical eggs. Because sometimes the problem wasn't the bird. It was what the bird produced. In Basel, Switzerland, in the 1470s, a chicken was burned at the stake for laying what was described as a supernatural egg. It was reportedly perfectly round, a shape so unnatural for eggs that it could only be the result of witchcraft. The people gathered, debated, and decided this wasn't just weird. It was dangerous. They convicted the chicken and executed her, then buried the egg under the courthouse, just in case. As we drift gently into the arms of sleep, it's important to understand the psychology behind this madness. Medieval people weren't stupid. They were scared. The world was terrifying. Death lurked everywhere, in the form of famine, plague, war, or bad fish. When you have no control, you start seeing patterns where none exist. You start assigning blame. And animals ever present, often weird, and lacking in proper Latin vocabulary, made easy targets. They couldn't defend themselves. They couldn't flee court. They couldn't file appeals. And so, for centuries, they suffered under a system that desperately needed symbolic control over an uncontrollable world. But there were moments of mercy. Strange, confusing moments. In a small Austrian village in 1545, a cat was put on trial for stealing bread from a church. But the village priest, instead of condemning it, declared that the cat was clearly hungry and should be given a home. The crowd agreed. The cat became the church mascot. It lived another 10 years and was buried with a small headstone that read, "May she never hunger again." A rare win. So as you lie there, eyes heavy, your brain latching onto images of courtrooms full of sheep wearing tiny hats, remember, you are safe. No one will accuse you of summoning rain. No one will put your goldfish on trial. No one will demand your dog explain the moon. Let the absurdity wash over you like a comforting blanket of ridiculous history. And let yourself drift, gently, slowly, into a world where cats no longer need lawyers and goats are just goats again. We'll keep the courtroom warm for the next trial. You wake up face down in a haystack. Again. You're not sure what's more insulting, the hay splinters jammed into your eyelids or the fact that someone's drawn a tiny crown on your head in goat milk. You look up. There's a courtroom. The bailiff is a donkey. The judge is a bishop. The defendant? A bear. You're not dreaming. You're in medieval Europe, and this bear has been accused of tax evasion. Let's unpack that. This chapter, and oh, it's a chewy one, is about the medieval performing animal industrial complex, which is both a real thing and also sounds like the worst circus-themed dystopia ever. Picture this: monkeys on trial for biting nobles, elephants being put in chains for disorderly conduct, and dancing bears being fined because their owners forgot to pay the local amusement tax. You've heard of bread and circuses. Now try stale rye and mildly terrifying animal acts. Let's begin, as we so often do, in France, where things were both weird and bureaucratically thorough. In the 13th century, French towns and cities became obsessed with regulating street performers, especially those with animals. Bears were the big-ticket item. Why? Because bears could be trained to dance in a circle, stand on their hind legs, and occasionally swat at tambourines like oversized toddlers who'd had too much wine. People loved it. They laughed. They cheered. But the church was not amused. You see, any activity that brought too much joy was automatically suspicious. Dancing bears, according to a 1297 clerical complaint, were an affront to the dignity of creation, mostly because they distracted people from sermons. So the city councils passed laws. If you had a dancing bear, you had to pay a fee. If the bear caused disturbance, you could be fined. If it injured someone, both you and the bear could be charged. In Lyon, in 1311, a bear bit a child's arm during a performance. The bear was arrested, placed in chains, and held in the town jail, which, yes, had cells big enough for bears, apparently. The owner protested. "It's just a bear," he said. "It didn't mean it." The judge agreed. The bear was released, but only after its owner paid for the child's treatment, the bear's board and lodging in prison, and a new collar made of bronze so it could be properly restrained. Bronze. For a bear. Because if you're going to chain an animal, you might as well make it stylish. Let's switch gears. To royal monkeys. Because if there's one thing medieval royalty loved more than crushing rebellions and oversalting venison, it was exotic pets. In the courts of France and England, monkeys were not only fashionable, they were basically living TikTok filters. Something to show off, laugh at, and occasionally use to insult visiting nobles. King Henry III of England, reigned 1216 to 1272, famously kept a menagerie at the Tower of London, which included lions, leopards, and at least 3 monkeys, one of which was known for drinking ale and stealing jewelry. And yes, you guessed it, one of these monkeys eventually stood trial. According to court records from 1248, a monkey belonging to the Queen's cousin was accused of theft after it stole a bracelet and hid it in a fireplace. The household servants believed it was cursed. The priest was called. The monkey was captured. A mini-trial was held, mostly to determine whether the monkey was possessed or simply mischievous. The verdict? Mischievous. The punishment? Exile from the royal household and relocation to a monastery, where it was cared for by confused monks who weren't entirely sure if they were housing a sinner or a saint. Modern translation: the monkey got transferred to a quiet desk job. But this wasn't an isolated case. In Florence, a pet monkey owned by a merchant was tried for blasphemy after reportedly imitating the bishop during a procession. Again, not joking. The monkey had been trained to mimic gestures, and apparently, it mimicked the wrong person. The punishment? A public apology was issued on behalf of the monkey. Because dignity is a luxury, and this was the 14th century. Meanwhile, back on the roads of Europe, the dancing bear circuit was still going strong. But it came with its own set of problems, especially in Germany, where the Hanseatic League, a medieval trade federation that took itself extremely seriously, decided to regulate performing animals like they were cargo. If you crossed certain borders with a bear, you had to declare it. If your bear sneezed near a market, and that market experienced a dip in bread sales, you could be accused of spiritual contamination. No, that's not a euphemism. It's a phrase used in actual court documents. One traveling performer was fined 18 silver groats because his monkey caused distraction and insulted the butcher's apprentice. What exactly the monkey did is lost to history, but we can assume it involved theft, screaming, or pants-related chaos. Now you might be thinking, okay, but surely they didn't try to put elephants on trial. Wrong again, dear listener. Let us turn our confused gaze to Portugal, where in 1514, an elephant gifted to King Manuel I from the Sultan of Gujarat was placed under symbolic house arrest after it rampaged through a garden party, knocking over tables and frightening a minor bishop. The elephant, known as Hanno, had done this completely by accident. It reportedly got spooked by fireworks, which, to be fair, is a reasonable response. But because there were clergymen involved, and because one of them ended up in a fountain, someone had to pay. The solution? The elephant was given a trial of character, in which scribes read aloud a list of the elephant's behaviors, some good, some chaotic, and concluded that it was not acting with malice, but needed better training. Imagine being the poor clerk writing up that case file. Elephant. Guilty of being large. The elephant was relocated to a quieter residence with fewer bishops. It lived out its days in relative peace, occasionally visited by poets who, understandably, had a lot of questions. There's a strange piece in all of this. A bizarre form of logic. You see, putting animals on trial gave humans a sense of control. It made the chaos feel manageable. Bears might bite. Monkeys might steal. Elephants might flatten your bishop. But if you could put them on trial, assign guilt, and issue a sentence, then the world didn't feel so random. It felt like a story, a fable, a system with consequences. Of course, none of it made any real sense. And if you're lying there now, blinking softly into the ceiling, wondering how any of this helped people sleep at night, you're not alone. They probably didn't sleep much, either. Not with plague rats tapping at the floorboards and oxen farting near the hearth. But perhaps, in its own ridiculous way, that was the point. These stories, as absurd as they are, were a way to explain the unexplainable. A way to laugh, or cry, or blame the bear when your taxes were late. So sleep easy tonight. The monkey is retired. The bear has paid its dues. And the elephant? It's just eating apples now, far away from the judgment of Mun. Close your eyes. We'll be back soon, and things are about to get even weirder. Because next, we're heading into the legal afterlife of convicted animals, exorcisms, ghost trials, and one inexplicably famous pig whose bones were buried in a cathedral. But only if you're ready. You wake up, unsurprisingly, in a crypt. It's musty, but not unpleasant. A little damp. Smells faintly of candle wax, spoiled incense, and something that may or may not be goat cheese. There are bones stacked neatly along the walls, labeled in Latin. One of them has a tiny crown carved above it. You reach for a torch. Light it. And there it is, a pig skeleton wearing a silk collar. Congratulations. You've just stumbled upon the afterlife of criminal animals. That's right. This chapter is about what happened after the trials, because, apparently, death wasn't always the end for a four-legged felon. Sometimes, death was just the beginning of ceremonial absolution, public burial, or in one deeply confusing case, veneration. Let's start with the infamous pig of Falaise. You remember her. We met her in Chapter 2. The porcine perpetrator of infanticide. Tried, convicted, executed, and then, oddly, mourned. According to multiple accounts from the town of Falaise in 1386, the pig who was publicly hanged for the death of a child was later buried in a consecrated plot, her grave marked with a wooden cross, and visited by townsfolk who debated whether she had been a symbol of justice or something more spiritual. Yes, people came to pay their respects to a pig that murdered a baby. Because medieval Europe, while terrifying, also had an overwhelming need for closure. And that didn't stop with the sentence. If an animal had been tried in court, truly tried, in all its parchment-filled, Latin-drenched glory, then it had entered the realm of the moral and the mythic. So, naturally, its remains needed to be dealt with spiritually. In some regions of France and Italy, animal criminals were exorcised before their execution, especially if the animal had been accused of acting under diabolical influence. Picture this, a donkey who kicked a priest being sprinkled with holy water while a monk reads from the Book of Tobit, trying to banish invisible demons from its hooves. This was not considered strange. This was standard protocol. And in the case of particularly corrupted animals, priests were instructed to withhold blessings even in death, meaning the animal could not be buried near church grounds. Instead, their bodies were often burned and scattered or left to rot in remote locations. This was considered a form of posthumous exile, like medieval ghost cancellation. But there were exceptions. Oh, were there exceptions? Let me introduce you to a story that sounds fake, but somehow isn't. In the town of Basel, Switzerland, a place already mentioned for its problematic chicken, see Chapter 6, there was a case in 1474 involving a rooster who laid an egg. You may recall this story. The rooster, accused of witchcraft for producing an unnatural object, was tried, convicted, and burned. But the egg? That egg became something of a relic. It was placed in a box, displayed in the town hall, surrounded by warnings about the dangers of unnatural birth. And eventually, it was passed down through generations of town officials like a cursed paperweight. No one wanted to touch it, but no one dared destroy it either. Because what if the rooster's spirit was still watching? Now, let's take a detour to Bavaria, where things get deeply supernatural. In 1541, a black dog was executed for attacking a nobleman's carriage. The dog was hanged, as usual, but afterward, several townspeople claimed to see its ghost wandering the roads at dusk. Over the next 6 months, travelers reported a howling shadow near the site of the execution. Carts overturned. Livestock fled. One man claimed the dog spoke Latin and asked for justice. The town council, after several emergency meetings and one very awkward exorcism involving a flute, decided to perform a posthumous retrial. They dug up the dog's body, reburied it facing east, and held a small public ceremony declaring it free of malicious intent. The sighting stopped. You'd think this would be a rare occurrence. But it's not. Ghost animals were a minor obsession in the late Middle Ages. Dogs, pigs, cats, even roosters. If one was believed to have been executed unjustly or too harshly, people believed its spirit could linger, causing misfortune, crop failures, or foot fungus. You know, the usual. This led to the rise of clerical animal burial rituals, especially in the countryside. Priests were sometimes paid to bless the corpses of executed animals before burial. One 1483 manual for rural clergy includes the following actual instruction. Shouldst thou be called to sanctify the remains of a mule, be not alarmed, for all creatures of God may yet walk in the light, even those condemned. If you're still awake, congratulations. You now know how to conduct a donkey funeral. Let's dig deeper. In certain monasteries, particularly in the Alpine regions, monks kept detailed ledgers of animal sins. Not just major crimes like homicide, but also lesser offenses, theft, public disturbance, inappropriate mating, and, in one memorable entry, unseemly flatulence during Vespers. What did they do with these ledgers? They read from them during Lent, as part of spiritual reflection. The idea was to remind humans of their own flaws by examining the sins of the lesser beasts. Think of it like the original BuzzFeed listicle, but with fewer gifts and more manure. And then there were the sainted animals. Because once in a while, a creature story took a sharp left turn, from convicted to celebrated. There's a 15th century tale from southern Italy of a donkey who was tried for blasphemous braying during Massachusetts. It was accused of disrupting the Eucharist by screaming during the priest's Latin chants. The town prepared for execution. But at the last minute, a traveling monk intervened, claiming the donkey's bray had actually harmonized with the psalm and was therefore divinely inspired. The charges were dropped. The donkey was spared. It became a minor celebrity. Over the next few decades, pilgrims came to touch the donkey, believing it brought musical blessings and throat healing. The donkey lived a long life and was buried with a carved stone that read, "He who sang with angels, though hooved and humble." Yes, that actually happened. It's strange to think about, isn't it? That in a world so often brutal, chaotic, and death-obsessed, there were these quiet moments of tenderness, of ritual, of recognition. Even if the subject was a pig, or a rooster, or a donkey who just wanted to express himself. The afterlife of animal criminals wasn't just about justice. It was about memory. People didn't just want to punish. They wanted to explain, to contextualize, to find peace. And sometimes they wanted to be forgiven, not by God, but by the creatures they had condemned. So tonight, as you lie there in the deepening silence, imagine a candlelit crypt. A line of monks. A small bell ringing as they walk past the tomb of a chicken who defied nature. A silent pig, now remembered not for violence, but for its place in the great, weird tapestry of history. Justice, in the Middle Ages, wasn't blind. It was just very, very strange. Let that absurdity comfort you. Let the stupidity wrap around you like a velvet robe. You're not on trial. You're not a dancing bear. You're just someone trying to sleep while a dead rooster haunts your subconscious. Close your eyes. We'll continue soon. You wake up under a cathedral. Not inside it. Under it. The floor is stone, cold and slightly moist, like a judgmental oyster. You're lying on what appears to be a pile of discarded altar cloths that smell suspiciously like wet fur. You sit up. Light filters down through a grate overhead. Somewhere, a choir is practicing badly. You hear a thump, and then an A. Because, in this particular cathedral, a horse is about to be canonized. Welcome to the blessed and legally complicated world of holy animals, where the line between sin and sainthood, crime and miracle, blurred so much that it tripped over itself and landed face first in incense. In this chapter, we look at the animals who weren't put on trial for their crimes, but instead, somehow, reversed the charges. Animals who bypassed the courtroom and went straight to the shrine. Creatures who committed what we'd now call medieval nonsense, but were celebrated for it. They weren't saints, exactly, but they were treated like divine interns. And we begin, as all good tales of misplaced holiness should, in Brittany, France, in the 14th century. There, in the village of Tréguier, a local goat allegedly saved a priest from bandits by charging them headfirst during an ambush. The goat was celebrated, dressed in ceremonial cloth, and given its own procession during Easter. When it died, they buried it in a grave marked with a cross and declared it a creature touched by God. And here's the kicker. 4 years afterward, villagers would gather around the goat's grave and pray for protection during travel. Not to God, to the goat. Now, you might ask, was the church okay with this? Of course not. But what were they going to do? Put the dead goat on trial? Again? The local bishop issued a formal statement that no soul should look to beasts for intercession. The villagers nodded politely and continued the annual goat procession anyway. Because nothing motivates rural piety like divine livestock. Let's ride this broken theological carousel a little further, to southern Germany, where one ox was believed to have performed a miracle in 1320. According to the chronicles of the Abbey of St. Attilian, the monastery's main bell had cracked. No money to repair it. No blacksmiths available. And then one night, an ox entered the courtyard, stopped at the bell, and began licking it. The next morning, the crack was gone. No one saw it happen. There were no witnesses. Just an ox, looking mildly guilty, standing next to a fully restored bell. The monks, naturally, took this as a sign. They named the ox Brother Clement, and while it was never ordained, because even monks have boundaries, it was allowed to attend morning prayers and was fed first at mealtime. When Brother Clement died, he was buried near the cloister, and for years afterward, monks would ring the miracle bell in his memory. Look, it's not the weirdest thing monks ever did. That honor goes to the monk who wrote an entire theology of hedgehog morality. Yes, that's real, and yes, it's coming in chapter 10. But before we get there, we need to visit the story of the trial of the bees, except in this case, the bees were not tried. They were praised. Let's set the stage. Year, 1492. Location, Lüneburg, Germany. Situation, local chapel burns down. No injuries, just one very confused bishop and a lot of smoldering hymnals. A week later, a swarm of bees shows up. No queen, no hive, just thousands of bees entering the ruins. They land, collectively, on a stone that survived the fire, the one with the 10 Commandments etched into it. They stay there. 4 days. Then weeks. Locals take this as a sign. The bees have chosen the word. A new chapel is built around the site, and a tiny apse is left open so the bees can come and go freely. They were called the Blessed Swarm, and to this day, beekeepers in that region say a little prayer before harvesting honey in the name of the bees who chose the word. Because sure, why not? We laugh now, but back then, animals weren't just nuisances or laborers or meat. They were symbols, agents of mystery, sometimes divine, sometimes demonic, sometimes both at once. Which brings us to the unofficial sainthood of Saint Guinefort. Yes, an actual dog. A greyhound, to be precise. In 13th century France, near Lyon, Guinefort was the pet of a nobleman. One day, the noble left his child in the dog's care, which, let's just pause there for a second. What could go wrong, right? He returned to find the crib overturned, blood on the dog's mouth. In a fit of rage, he killed the dog on the spot, only to discover, moments later, that the blood belonged to a snake. The greyhound had defended the baby. Regret. Guilt. Immediate canonization. The locals built a shrine to Guinefort. Women brought their sick children to the site for healing. Pilgrimages began. The church was horrified. Because not only was Guinefort a dog, he was a dog with no official miracle license. Church authorities tried to stamp it out. They declared the shrine heretical. They tore it down. But the locals rebuilt it. Again, and again, and again. And Guinefort remained a saint in the eyes of the people, the unofficial patron of unjustly accused protectors. Now you might ask, were there rituals? Oh yes. They'd bring their babies, lay them on straw, walk around the shrine 3 times, leave an offering, usually bread or a small bone, and then go home, praying for the dog's protection. It sounds ridiculous, but if you've ever whispered to a pet, "Please help me get through this," then you understand. Guinefort wasn't just a story. He was comfort. And in the Middle Ages, that meant everything. One last tale, and it's a beautiful mess. In the 15th century, in a town near Naples, there lived a cat named Benvenuto. He belonged to a poor widow. Every morning, Benvenuto would sit on the widow's windowsill and yowl, loud, tuneless, grating, right as the church bells rang for matins. At first, people were annoyed. Then someone said, "Maybe he's singing to God." And suddenly, Benvenuto was holy. Children brought him scraps. Old women whispered prayers into his fur. A friar wrote a poem in his honor. When Benvenuto died, they buried him beneath the steps of the church. A few years later, during renovations, the bones were discovered and moved into a small niche with a plaque. It read, "He sang before the bells. He sang before the Lord." So here you are, lying in the dark, surrounded by half-remembered saints, toothy ghosts, and one musically inclined feline. It's a strange world, this history of ours. But it's oddly comforting, isn't it? That even in a time of plague, superstition, and very bad soup, people still wanted to believe that animals could be more. Not just beasts, not just food, but protectors, witnesses, guides, maybe even friends. So tonight, rest easy under the silent watch of Guinefort. Dream of goats in golden robes, of bells healed by ox tongues, of bees who chose the stone with commandments. Sleep knowing that somewhere, in a forgotten corner of a forgotten monastery, there's a gravestone that simply says, "He was a good boy." And nobody questioned it. You wake up in a monastery. Again. Only this time, it's 1465, and you're barefoot, holding a goose feather quill and staring at a stack of parchment so tall it's leaning slightly, like it wants to crush you but hasn't committed yet. A bell tolls outside. The kind of slow, sleepy bell that sounds less like a call to prayer and more like a complaint. Your cell smells like candle wax and damp wool, and your mattress, if we can call this heap of hay and regret a mattress, smells like betrayal and onions. And beside you, on a wooden table, lies a manuscript. Its title? De Bestiis Moralibus, on the moral qualities of beasts. Welcome to the deeply unsettling world of medieval animal morality manuals. Because while you spent the last 9 chapters watching animals on trial or being turned into saints, we now arrive at the place where theologians went full Dr. Dolittle. If Dr. Dolittle were profoundly repressed and believed hedgehogs held the key to salvation, these texts, called bestiaries, were more than just medieval picture books of animals that didn't exist, although yes, they did include things like unicorns, manticores, and whatever a bonacon is. They were moral instruction manuals. Each animal had a lesson. Each behavior had spiritual implications. And yes, that means the hedgehog got its own section. Are you ready for this? The medieval hedgehog, according to the Aberdeen Bestiary circa 1200 AD, collects grapes by rolling on them. It then carries the grapes back to its den, impaled on its spines like some kind of divine cocktail stick. The lesson? Thus must man collect virtue as the hedgehog gathers grapes and carry it humbly to the storehouse of his soul. If you're thinking, that doesn't sound like something a hedgehog would do, you're absolutely right. But when accuracy is optional and moral symbolism is mandatory, biology tends to lose. Let's spin the wheel and see what other moral crimes against nature we can find. The beaver? Absolutely guilty. Of what, you ask? Self-castration. You see, medieval people believed that the beaver's testicles were a prized medical ingredient. Hunters would chase them down. So the noble beaver, in a fit of logical despair, would bite off its own testicles and throw them at the hunters, saying, "Take these and leave me be." This was interpreted as a lesson in detachment from sin and offering yourself to God. Yes, seriously. There's even an illustration of a beaver mid-self-surgery, smiling serenely. 10 out of 10 for commitment. Minus several points for anatomical understanding. The lion, triple threat. Lions were the Jesus of the animal world, noble, strong, and with suspiciously perfect hair. The bestiaries claimed that a lion's cubs are born dead and only come to life 3 days later when the father roars at them. Lions sleep with their eyes open. Lions only erase their tracks with their tails so hunters can't follow. This, according to the monks, meant that lions symbolize Christ's resurrection, divine vigilance, eyes open, and spiritual discretion, tail sweeping. Or maybe lions were just very good at hiding their snacks. Let's visit the barn owl, which medieval texts treated as a creature of spiritual ugliness. Why? Because it only flies at night. It avoids the sun. Ergo, sin. This means that, had you been an owl in the 12th century, you'd have been accused of spiritual laziness and possibly heresy. No trial necessary. Just public shame and maybe some poorly aimed stones from children learning the catechism. But not all animals were morally bankrupt. Some were aspirational. Take the pelican, which was believed to pierce its own breast with its beak to feed its young with blood. It's a horrible image, especially considering it's completely untrue. Still, that didn't stop generations of monks from saying, "Be like the pelican, sacrifice everything for your spiritual children." Church artwork from the 13th to 16th centuries is full of pelicans bleeding onto their chicks in a kind of feathered passion play. So next time you see an old cathedral with a blood-spattered bird carved into the woodwork, now you know. Speaking of birds, we can't leave without discussing the crane. Crane behavior was moralized into duty and discipline. Monks were told to imitate cranes, who, when sleeping in flocks, would assign one member to stay awake and stand on one leg holding a rock. If the crane nodded off, it would drop the rock and wake up. Be as vigilant as the crane, they said. Because apparently there's nothing quite like shame-based avian surveillance to inspire discipline. The fox, meanwhile, was the medieval world's walking red flag. The animal version of "he'll love you and ghost you within 3 days." Foxes were seen as liars, deceivers, masters of disguise. If a fox could have a LinkedIn, it would be all lies and Photoshop credentials. Foxes were said to pretend to be dead to lure in birds. They'd lie on their backs, tongues out, and wait. When a bird came near to investigate the corpse, the fox would leap up and pounce. Of course, this behavior also inspired parables about false teachers and the devil masquerading as good. Moral of the story: never trust a fox. Especially not one with Oscar-worthy acting skills. There's a kind of desperate beauty in all this. In a world of famine, war, plague, and dental care that doubled as a form of spiritual punishment, medieval people looked at animals and saw not just beasts, but metaphors, symbols, lessons. Even snails had morals. Yes, snails. They were considered cowardly because they retreat into their shells when attacked. Which means, naturally, they symbolize cowardly Christians who refuse to fight spiritual battles. How does one fight a spiritual battle, you ask? Apparently, with the courage of a morally upright manticore and the discipline of a one-legged crane. And let's not forget the weasel, who was believed to conceive offspring through its mouth and give birth through its ear. We could go into the symbolism here, but honestly, maybe it's better we don't. Now, you might be wondering, did these moralizations impact how animals were treated? Yes, deeply. An animal accused of being satanic might be burned, drowned, or exiled. But one seen as embodying divine virtues, it might be protected, revered, painted into the margins of illuminated manuscripts, decked out in golden halos, and occasionally, just occasionally, paraded through town dressed in ceremonial robes. So tonight, as you drift deeper into sleep, remember, your cat may be shedding fur on your pillow, but in 12th century France, it could have been accused of consorting with demons. Your goldfish may look boring, but it would have been morally praised for its silence and contemplation. And that dog snoring beside you? Saint material. You live in a world where animals are companions. Back then, they were teachers, villains, and sometimes spiritual cautionary tales wrapped in fur. It was a time when donkeys could be executed, pigs put on trial, bees worshipped, and hedgehogs cited in theological debate. A time of superstition, yes, but also of strange, creative reverence. So, as the bells toll in your imaginary monastery and your imaginary candle flickers down to a stub, remember the animals who came before, the saints, the sinners, the wrongly accused, and yes, the pelicans who bled. Sleep now under the careful eye of the bestiary. A moral zoo of sleeping metaphors, twitching slightly in their dreams of grapes, ghosts, and misfiled heresies.